The Galactic Conclave's Great Hall was built to make visitors feel grateful. The ceiling was so high that real clouds formed near the top, engineered ones, drifting between the support columns like they had been placed there by someone with very expensive taste. The floor was black stone polished to a mirror finish. Every chair at the main table was sized for the species sitting in it. The temperature, the lighting, the faint background hum of the air system, all of it tuned to the precise comfort settings of whoever was scheduled to walk through the door. The Conclave had been doing this for 400 years. They were very good at the details. Ambassador Yara Osei walked in and did not look at the ceiling. She had learned a long time ago that the ceiling was the whole point. You were supposed to look up, and you were supposed to feel the scale of it pressing down on you. Feel how small your planet was, how new your species was, how much you owed to the beings at that long table. The ceiling was a tool. Yara had spent 22 years sitting in rooms like this one. She knew every tool they had. She sat down. Across from her, Speaker Theron IV arranged 8 arms into something that passed for an open, welcoming posture among his kind. He had 3 brain clusters housed in one skull, a distinction his species cared about deeply and explained at length whenever they got the chance. He wore the Conclave's colors, deep blue and gold. He had been preparing for this meeting for 6 months, and it showed in the careful way he held himself. He, like a man who has rehearsed a conversation so many times, he has forgotten that the other person does not know their lines. Yara had been preparing for 3 years, since the exact morning she had understood what they were going to offer and why. The ceremony took 2 hours, speeches in 17 languages, formal translation delays that everyone pretended were not awkward, a reading of the Colonial Sovereignty Accord, article by article, while Yara's translation bead whispered the text into her ear in clean, flat English. There was a musical interlude. The Conclave always included musical interludes. It was meant to feel like culture, like generosity, like celebration. The planet's name was Kareth 9. She already knew everything about it. Every public record, every exploration log, every atmospheric survey the Conclave had released. She had also read 3 classified documents that a contact inside the Conclave's own science division had passed to her 9 months ago, at a cost she would never put in any official file. Kareth 9 had 4 atmospheric layers. 3 of them would dissolve human lung tissue within 4 minutes of unfiltered exposure. Gravity was 1.3 times Earth standard, not enough to crush you outright, just enough to make every day feel like a debt your body was slowly collecting on. The surface temperature swung between -40 and +70 over an 18-hour day cycle. The native megafauna averaged 12 meters in height. The smaller ones averaged 6. There were no small ones, really, not in any sense that counted. The local plant life excreted a contact toxin through its root system. The toxin caused nerve disruption, skin blistering, and in cases of prolonged exposure, a kind of cellular breakdown that the medical reports described in very careful, very steady language. The plant life smelled like cinnamon. The Conclave classified habitable worlds on a scale from Class 1 to Class 12. Class 1 was Earth standard. Class 12 required full industrial atmospheric support just to maintain a surface presence and was considered the outer edge of what any known species had attempted. Classes 13, 14, and 15 existed in the classification system the way the last pages of an old atlas existed. They're technically, but mostly unread, describing places that were more useful as warnings than destinations. Kareth 9 was Class 15. The Conclave was offering it to humanity as a gift. Speaker Theron IV finished his presentation, but he folded 3 pairs of arms and looked at Yara with a specific expression that meant he considered this conversation already over and was simply waiting for the formality of her agreement to catch up. "Ambassador Osei," he said, through the translation system, in a voice that was meant to carry to the back of the hall and did. "The Galactic Conclave offers the human species full colonial sovereignty over Kareth 9. No conclave jurisdiction, no resource claims, no territorial limitations, a world that is entirely and irrevocably yours." The hall was very quiet. "Noted," Yara said. She did not sleep that night. Her quarters in the Conclave Embassy District were comfortable in the particular way that all Conclave-provided spaces were comfortable. precisely, efficiently, with a kind of comfort that felt designed rather than felt. She sat at her small desk with the atmospheric data on her screen and read it twice in the public version and once in the classified one, because once was enough. She made coffee, real coffee, from a small supply she kept for specific kinds of nights. She sat with the cup and looked out at the embassy plaza where the engineered fountains ran all night, running water being something the conclave had determined made visiting species feel at ease. She thought about 50,000 people, not as a number, as specific people, because she had read every name on the Colonial Manifest 3 times, and names had a way of sticking. Engineers, the largest group, over 8,000 of them. Medical staff, just under 6,000. Agricultural specialists, teachers, physicists, biologists, construction workers, system administrators. Or 3 people who had listed their occupation as artist and who had been approved because nobody on the selection board had the heart to turn them away when the planet they were being sent to was already terrible enough. One jazz musician named Marcus Webb, who had signed up, according to his application file, because the colonial brochure mentioned mountains. The brochure had not mentioned what lived in the mountains. She had considered telling them, making a transmission, laying out what she knew, what she suspected, the full shape of why this specific planet had been chosen for this specific offer. She had sat with that consideration for 3 weeks, and in the end she had put it down, because if they knew, they might not go, and if they did not go, the conclave would find another solution, a quieter one that left no colony at all, just 50,000 people who became a notation in a closed file. Better to go, better to build something, better to have the evidence reach them on the other side, where they could use it. She finished her coffee. In the morning, she accepted the offer. The conclave delegation's relief was visible. That was the thing that settled into the deepest part of Yara's memory, the thing she would carry for a long time afterward. The way they relaxed. Theron 4's posture shifted. 3 other delegates exchanged a look that they did not bother to hide because they had spent 400 years being the most powerful beings in any room and had stopped noticing that other species could read a room too. She signed the Colonial Sovereignty Accord. She pressed her thumb to the biometric seal. She smiled. "We the conclave is pleased," Theron 4 said. "I'm sure it is," Yara said. The loading process at the transit station took 3 weeks. Supply crates floated through the bay doors in a steady stream. Construction materials, medical equipment, seed banks, water filtration systems, power generation units, communication arrays, the compressed infrastructure of a civilization trying to exist somewhere it had not existed before. Yara stood on the observation deck and watched it all move with the particular feeling of someone who has set something in motion and cannot stop it now, and is not sure they would even if they could. The people came last. Families carrying bags. Children running ahead, because children ran ahead regardless of where they were going or what waited on the other side. An elderly man who moved slowly but moved. When a young woman with a braid down her back and a hard hat already clipped to her pack. Cassius Veld came through the boarding gate with his daughter Lena on one side and a tablet full of schematics on the other. He was a large man, the kind of large that came from decades of actual physical work. Gray at the temples, with a way of walking that said he had already mentally mapped the space he was entering and found it manageable. He had spent 20 years in Chicago infrastructure, building things in a city that was always, in some section or another, falling apart, which meant he had spent 20 years learning how to hold things together with less than he needed and still make it work. Lena was 9 years old. She had an inhaler clipped to her belt. She looked at the colony ship the way someone looked at a decision that was already made. Dorna Cassius looked up and caught Yara's eye across the boarding corridor. He nodded once. She nodded back. The gate closed. Theron 4 did not watch the transports leave. He had other work. There was always other work. The conclave ran on the accumulated weight of other work. Reports, sessions, consensus building, the long, slow machinery of governing species that did not always want to be governed. He had been running that machinery for 40 years, and he was good at it in the way that a person was good at something they had done for so long that the shape of it had grown into the shape of them. The humans had been a problem for 11 years, not a loud problem. Loud problems were simple. You overwhelmed them or you waited them out. The humans were a quiet problem. They made friends with species the conclave needed isolated. They asked about records that were sealed for perfectly good historical reasons. They survived situations that were designed to make them stop surviving, and then kept going as if the situation had been nothing remarkable. 3 years ago, human diplomats had brokered a peace between the Vorath and the Sekal. Two species the conclave had spent 4 decades carefully maintaining at low-grade hostility because Vorath-Sekal conflict kept both of them occupied and their shared resource corridor accessible for conclave extraction. The peace had taken the humans 4 months. It had undone 40 years of work. Theron 4 had spent 6 months after that building the consensus for Karath 9. 9 votes in favor, 4 opposed. The 4 who opposed had filed their objections in the formal record, which was their right. Only they had then been reassigned to committees where their objections would not cause further problems, which was the conclave's right. The solution was clean. Colonial sovereignty meant no conclave obligation to respond to distress signals from a sovereign world. That was in the Accord, Article 7, subsection C, written in the kind of language that revealed itself only on a careful fourth reading. The humans had signed it. Their ambassador had signed with a steady hand and a warm smile and said noted in a voice he had filed away and occasionally thought about afterward. He pulled up the observation satellite feed from Karath 9. The planet filled the screen, brown and gray and turbulent, the upper atmosphere churned by the permanent weather systems that the classification system listed simply as extreme. Beautiful in a distant, a severe kind of way. He gave the colony 4 months. His team privately said 3. He returned to his other work. Marcus Webb found a window seat and sat in it for 6 hours before he talked to anyone. He pressed his forehead against the cold port glass and looked at the stars moving outside. He had never been in space before. He had expected to feel something enormous about it. The scale, the distance, the fact of leaving behind everything he had ever known. Instead, he mostly felt very quiet in a way he didn't have a word for yet. He had packed a saxophone, 3 changes of clothes, a backup of his sheet music, a photograph of his grandmother, and a book about mountain ecosystems that he was already 80 pages into. The book described Karath 9's mountain ranges as geologically significant formations with elevations reaching 9,000 meters in the northern hemisphere. It did not describe what lived on the slopes. The conclave's public colonial materials had described the planet as a challenging but rewarding environment. He had read that and imagined something like a Canadian winter, which he had never experienced either, but had seen in photographs. He fell asleep with the book open on his lap. 3 weeks to Karath 9 at FTL transit speed. Outside the window, the stars moved slowly past, cold and far away, and not paying attention to any of this. In the Conclave Embassy District, in a cargo section of a private facility that was not on any official manifest. A tight beam transmitter came online 2 hours after the transports cleared Conclave jurisdiction. It sent 3 files. The first was a complete analysis of Karath 9, including the classified atmospheric data in 12 languages. The second was a contact list. Every independent species network outside Conclave jurisdiction with encrypted frequencies. The third was a plain text document. No accusations, no arguments, just data. Clean and organized and patient, written in the way that a person wrote something they expected to be read later when the time for it arrived. The transmission took 40 seconds. The system wiped itself clean immediately after. Yara sat in her quarters and watched the confirmation come in. She closed the application. She made coffee. Outside, the engineered fountains ran in the plaza, was steady and peaceful and completely artificial. She sat with the coffee and waited. The next part was already beginning. She just couldn't see it from here. Karath 9 hung in its orbit, as it always had, brown and gray and churned at the edges by its own permanent storms. 12-meter creatures moved across its surface in their migration routes. The cinnamon-scented plant life covered the valley floors in the thick, toxic mats. The atmosphere did what it had always done. The planet had no idea what was coming. Neither really did anyone else. Karath 9 from orbit looked like a bruise. Brown and purple and gray, wrapped in cloud layers that rotated in directions that didn't match each other, each atmospheric band spinning on its own logic. The planet had no moon. It had 3 rings of asteroid debris that the light caught at certain angles and made briefly beautiful. the way very dangerous things sometimes were. The colony ships held their approach pattern for 2 hours, while the navigation team ran atmospheric entry calculations for the fourth time. Nobody rushed them. Everyone pressed to the port windows and looked down, and nobody said much, because there wasn't much to say that the view wasn't already saying loudly. Cassius Veld stood at the back of the observation gallery and looked at the planet and did what he had always done with hard things. He broke it into parts. The landing zone was pre-surveyed. Flat terrain, northern continent, protected from the worst of the wind patterns by a natural ridge formation to the west. Good bedrock for foundation anchoring. 3 underground aquifers within drilling range. The conclave's public geological data showed mineral deposits that would support manufacturing once the colony was stable enough to think about manufacturing, which was not now, but now was for surviving, and surviving was a project he understood. "Dad," Lena said next to him. "Yeah, it's really big." "It is. Does big mean bad?" He thought about that. "Big means we have room," he said. She seemed to accept that. She pressed her forehead against the glass and kept looking. Day 1. The landing sequence took 14 hours. 6 ships, 6 separate touchdown sequences, each one kicking up enormous clouds of Kareth-9 dust that the wind carried east in long brown tails. The landing struts sank 2 feet into the surface before hitting solid rock, which was 2 feet more than the specs had expected. And Cassius had spent 30 minutes that morning recalculating dome anchoring loads while everyone else was still finding their ground legs. The pre-assembled domes deployed from cargo containers in a sequence the engineering team had practiced 40 times in simulation. They went up faster than the simulations had predicted, which was the first good news. The seals were checked and checked again. Air processors cycled. The filtered atmosphere inside Dome 1 registered breathable at 14:32 local time, which was also the first time anyone had been able to take off their helmet in 16 hours. And the sound of 50,000 people exhaling relief was something Marcus Webb later wrote about in the journal he had started keeping, because he had realized very quickly that he was inside a thing that needed to be written down. At 1907, Dome 3's atmospheric seal failed. The breach was in a junction panel that had taken impact stress during landing. The ground was harder than the simulation expected, which was a theme that would keep recurring. Unfiltered Kareth-9 air entered Dome 3 for 11 seconds before the emergency closure protocols engaged. 7 people were in the direct exposure zone. They died before the medical team reached them. Day 2 was quiet in the way that a space is quiet when people are moving carefully through it and not looking at each other too directly. The megafauna came at dusk. They came from the east, following a migration route that the conclave's data had marked as seasonal, which meant predictable, which meant manageable, which meant something the conclave's data was very confident about. The data was confident about the timing in the general direction. The data was not particularly clear on scale. The lead creature was 14 meters. It moved with the slow, vast certainty of something that had never needed to hurry, because nothing on Kareth-9 had ever given it a reason to. It walked through the outer perimeter markers the way a person walks through tall grass. Not aggressively, not consciously, just because they were there, and the path continued through them. The outer perimeter went down in 40 seconds. What followed was 3 hours of organized chaos that the incident report later described as a challenging initial encounter with native megafauna, in language so restrained it was almost a different document than the recordings. People ran. People shouted. The engineering team deployed emergency barriers that the creatures ignored because the creatures were 14 meters tall, and the barriers were designed for Class 8 fauna, and nobody had seriously thought through what Class 15 meant in practical terms until this specific moment when it was too late for the thinking to help. 12 more people died that night. Cassius did not sleep. He sat with his team in the engineering bay, with 3 screens open and a cold cup of coffee that someone had brought him 2 hours ago, and he worked through the perimeter redesign in real time, adjusting as new data came in from the barrier cameras that were still functioning. He talked slowly and clearly and didn't raise his voice once. His team talked back. They argued about load tolerances and anchor materials and the electromagnetic deterrent systems that had arrived in the cargo and not yet been deployed. At 4 a.m., they had a plan. "We've worked with worse," Cassius said. which was not true, and everyone in the room knew it. And nobody said so because the plan was good, and they needed to believe in the plan. They got to work. Month 1 was attrition. The total came to 89 dead by the end of it. Dome failures, fauna encounters, 2 medical emergencies that would have been minor on Earth and were fatal on Karath 9 because the resources for handling minor emergencies were not yet fully unpacked. The surviving 50,000 and change moved through those 30 days with the specific kind of momentum that had nothing to do with optimism and everything to do with the fact that stopping meant looking at the numbers, and nobody wanted to look at the numbers. They built instead. The electromagnetic deterrence went up around the upgraded perimeter and held, not perfectly, not every time, but enough. The megafauna still tested the barriers periodically, walked into the deterrent field, registered the discomfort, and turned away. Progress. The air processors were upgraded. The dome seals were re-engineered with a redundancy system that Cassius designed himself, working from first principles because the manufacturer's specs were for a Class 9 environment, and this was not that. The new seals held. They had held for 3 weeks straight by the end of month 1, which was the kind of small victory that felt enormous when you were inside it. The cinnamon-smelling plant life, which the colonists had named sweetgrass, because humans named everything immediately, it was a reflex, turned out to be the most dangerous element in the ground-level environment. It grew everywhere, and its root system spread underground, and if you walked on it long enough in boots with worn seals, you found out about the toxin the hard way. 4 people found out the hard way in month 1. The solution was better boot seals, a new mapping system to track sweetgrass coverage, and a protocol that required all ground teams to carry a scanner that turned red when the root density exceeded safe threshold. The protocol worked, mostly. Marcus Webb planted a small cactus in his quarters. He was not sure why. It felt important to grow something. Month 2. The Conclave observation satellite picked up the colony's thermal signature expanding. Theron 4's morning briefing noted this and flagged it as within expected variance. His analyst looked at the expanding signature and did not say anything because she had been told that her comments at the previous briefing had been noted and not in the good way. What was happening on the ground was that Cassius Veld's team had established a secondary dome and connected it to the primary via an enclosed corridor that they had built from materials not originally designed for corridor construction because they had run out of corridor materials in week 3. And the secondary dome housed the agricultural systems, hydroponic bays under artificial lighting, because Karath 9's sun was present, but its spectrum was wrong for most earth crops without filtering. The hydroponics team had 12 species of vegetables growing in controlled conditions. None of them were particularly good yet, but they were there. The medical team had set up a proper triage and treatment center in month 2 after 2 weeks of running everything from a converted cargo bay. The doctor in charge was a woman named Dr. Adais Nwosu, who had spent 15 years in emergency medicine in Lagos and who approached Karath 9 with the same focused pragmatism she had applied to every previous impossible situation, which was identify what you have, identify what you need, build the gap between them as fast as you can. She had 62 medical staff. She needed 90. She managed with 62 by scheduling people in shifts that were probably not compliant with any labor regulation that existed on any world that had labor regulations, which Karath 9 did not yet, technically. By month 2, deaths had slowed, not stopped, but slowed. The colony was learning the shape of the danger around it, the way you learn the shape of a dark room, by moving through it, by running into things, by building a map from the pain of impact. Month 3, something shifted. It was hard to name the exact moment. It wasn't a single event. It was more that at some point in the 3rd month, the colony stopped surviving by the skin of its teeth and started surviving with a little room to spare. Not comfort, there was no comfort, but margin. Enough margin that people started doing things beyond the minimum. A school opened. There were 63 children in the colony. Someone had to do something about that. 2 teachers set up in a section of the primary dome that wasn't being used for anything else and started teaching. Lena Veld was in the oldest group. She was a diligent student and also the kind of child who asked questions that occasionally made the teacher stop and think before answering. She had not needed her inhaler in 3 weeks. Her father noticed. He mentioned it to Dr. Nwosu. Dr. Nwosu ran Lena through the respiratory assessment she ran on every colonist monthly and found that Lena's lung function metrics had improved. Not slightly, measurably. Why in a direction that did not match the expected trajectory for a child with documented chronic asthma in a high-stress, physically demanding environment. It's probably the air processors, Dr. Nwosu said, and wrote it down. She did not entirely believe it was the air processors. She wrote it down anyway because she did not have a better answer, and there was too much else to do. The megafauna migration came again in month 3, and the colony was ready for it. The deterrent field held the creatures at the perimeter. What happened next was something nobody had designed and nobody had planned for. Cassius's team, watching the migration from the camera arrays, noticed that the creatures moved in consistent patterns, not random movements, routes. The same routes, day after day, with minor variations based on weather. Was someone on the team started mapping it, not to avoid the creatures, to understand them. It was the kind of thing that happens when people have slightly more time than they strictly need to survive and not quite enough time to relax. They start solving the next problem. Humans did this constantly. It was not always a good quality. On Kareth 9 in month 3, it turned out to be a useful one. Month 5. The Conclave Observer satellite sent its latest data package to Theron 4's office. He read it twice. Colony population, 49,107. Loss of 1,105 from initial manifest. Attrition rate had slowed to a fraction of the projected curve. Infrastructure, expanded beyond initial colony plan. Agricultural output, approaching 40% of dietary needs from local production. Its defense structure, upgraded beyond any Class 15 colonial spec in the Conclave's historical records, because the Conclave's historical records did not contain a Class 15 colony that had survived past month 4. He called his analyst. She came in and stood across the desk from him and waited. "Explain the population graph," he said. She pulled it up. The line went down steeply in month 1, flattened in months 2 and 3, stabilized in month 4, and in month 5 had bent slightly upward. "They stopped dying as fast," she said. "And 2 weeks ago, 5 children were born." Theron 4 looked at the graph for a long time. "Adjust the models," he said. She adjusted the models. The new projections were not reassuring. The birth that mattered most happened on day 147. Priya Mehta had been pregnant before boarding the transport. Not by choice, not by plan, and not something she had disclosed during the selection process because she was the best structural materials engineer on the applicant list, and she was not going to be left behind for something that was nobody's business but hers. She had managed the pregnancy through the worst of it quietly with Dr. Nwosu's private help, and on day 147, she went into labor in the medical center while a Kareth 9 storm system was rattling the dome seals outside. The birth was difficult but not catastrophic. Dr. Nwosu had attended more difficult ones. The baby came out loud and healthy and already seemed annoyed about something, which Dr. Nwosu privately considered a good sign for someone about to live on a Class 15 Deathworld. She was named Amara. 32 minutes after the birth, while Dr. Nwosu was completing the post-delivery assessment and a young technician named Obi was running the standard atmospheric checks on the medbay systems, Obi made an error. He hit the wrong control sequence. A maintenance seal on the secondary ventilation junction opened. It was supposed to be a diagnostic cycle, a 30-second procedure that should have opened only the internal recycling loop. Instead, it opened the external vent. Kareth 9 air entered the medbay. 4.3 seconds. The alarm triggered at 4.3 seconds, and the emergency closure engaged and the vent sealed. Amara was on the examination table. She was 32 minutes old. The unfiltered air hit her face and she breathed it in the automatic, unconscious way that new lungs breathe everything. Without judgment, without defense, and just the fundamental reflex of being alive. Then the air sealed off. The processed, filtered atmosphere returned. The alarm stopped. Obi was already across the room, already reaching for the emergency respiratory kit, his face the color of someone who understood what he had just done. Dr. Nwosu was already at the table. She checked the baby. Amara was breathing. She was breathing steadily. She had breathed Kareth 9 atmosphere, 3 parts of which were actively hostile to human tissue, for 4.3 seconds, and she was lying on the table breathing with the calm efficiency of a healthy infant who had no idea what had just happened. The room was very quiet. Obi was crying. He was trying not to, but he was. Dr. Nosu ran the assessment 3 times. Then she sat down in a chair that she pulled up to the table, and she ran it a 4th time. All 4 assessments returned the same result. The baby was fine. She was fine. She was perfectly, completely, by every available measurement, fine. The xenobiology report took 9 weeks to compile. The Conclave's observer satellite had caught the vent incident on its sensors. Atmospheric anomaly detected, cross-referenced with colony life sign data, flagged for review. The review team was very thorough. They were very good scientists. They ran the data 12 times. The report was 340 pages long. The conclusion was a single paragraph, the last 3 words of which were, "This should not." Honuta Theranfor read the conclusion and then read the rest of the report and then sat very still at his desk for a long time in the way that a person sat still when they had been very confident about something for a very long time, and reality had just made a quiet and devastating argument in the other direction. He did not change any of his decisions. He told himself this was because there was nothing to be changed. The colony was on Kareth 9. The accord was signed. Article 7, subsection C was clear. The thing was done. He believed this. He went back to his other work. On Karath 9, in a medbay that smelled like antiseptic and recycled air, Amara slept in a heated unit and breathed with the unconscious confidence of something that had already, without knowing it, done the most consequential thing it would ever do. She did not know this. Only she was 9 weeks old. She just kept breathing. Year 3 on Karath 9, and the colony had a market. Not a formal market. Nobody had organized it. Nobody had approved a plan for it. It had simply appeared in the wide corridor that connected Dome 4 to Dome 6. The way useful things appeared when people had slightly more than they needed of one thing and slightly less than they needed of another. Someone brought extra hydroponic yield to trade. Someone else brought fabricated tools. A third person arrived with something they had made from Kareth 9 materials that didn't have an official name yet, but was becoming valued. And the corridor became a market the way a river became a river, because it was the natural direction for things to flow. There were 43 stalls on market day. So Cassius walked through it on a Tuesday morning with a cup of coffee that had gone cold and a list of structural assessments he was supposed to be reviewing. He kept stopping, not because he needed to buy anything, just because the market was evidence of something he could not quite put into words but recognized the way you recognized a load-bearing wall, by what it was holding up. People were arguing about prices, children were running between stalls. An old man who had been a crop scientist in Kerala was selling something he called a soil amendment and explaining its properties to anyone who would listen, which on a good day was 3 or 4 people. Marcus Webb was in the corner playing saxophone. It was not great for market acoustics. It echoed off the dome walls in complicated ways. And nobody asked him to stop because it turned out that after 2 years of dome seal alarms and fauna deterrent signals and emergency klaxons, a saxophone playing Autumn Leaves badly in a corridor was a sound that people walked toward rather than away from. "We've worked with worse," Cassius told his coffee, and kept walking. Population count, year 3, 49,107. Same number as month 5. No movement up, no movement down. Births and deaths in approximate balance, which on a Class 15 Deathworld in its 3rd year of existence was a statistic that the Conclave's observation team had needed to cross-reference 4 times before accepting. The colony was not growing, but it had stopped shrinking. That was the wall Cassius had set his back against and pushed for 3 years without stopping. Not to build something great, not yet. Well, just to get to the place where the numbers stopped going down. He had succeeded. He treated this success with the same expression he used for all successes. Brief acknowledgement, then attention to the next problem. The next problem was food. 40% of the colony's diet came from local production. Hydroponics mostly, some aquaponic systems that had been added in year 2, and a small but growing contribution from the work the agricultural team was doing with Karath 9 native species. The native plant life was the challenge. Most of it was toxic in ways that the human digestive system handled very badly. A few varieties were merely unpleasant. 2 had been identified in year 2 as potentially edible if processed correctly, which was the operative phrase. Nari processed correctly meant a 6-stage preparation protocol that took 48 hours and still left the result tasting like something between old leather and disappointment. The colonists ate it anyway. A food scientist named Raji had spent month 3 through year 2 crossbreeding Carath-9's edible plant species with each other and with earth strains adapted for the local environment. She had failed many times and kept clear records of each failure, which she considered progress of a different kind. In year 3, she produced something from a cross of 2 native species that was, in her own assessment, not actively bad. Cassius tried it. "It tastes like ambition," he said. "It has a nutritional profile that makes earth spinach look like dessert," Raji said. "Call it Carath salad," Cassius said. "We put it on the menu." Raji put it on the menu. The colony ate it. Nobody loved it. Everyone ate it because it was food and food was what you had, and being alive on Carath-9 had a way of clarifying priorities very efficiently. Lena Veld turned 12 in year 3, which was also the year that Dr. Nwosu stopped recording asthma attacks in Lena's medical file, because there had not been any to record. She had not had an attack in 14 months. Dr. Nwosu ran her through the full respiratory panel every quarter, out of professional obligation and personal fascination that she kept separate in her own mind. The lungs of a 12-year-old girl who had been a documented, medicated, oxygen-dependent asthmatic since age 4 showed no active inflammation, no airway hyperreactivity, function metrics in the 94th percentile for her age group. In year 2, she had published a paper through the colony's research network noting the anomaly, suggesting the air processor filtration had some beneficial property and inviting further study. In year 3, she published a second paper noting that the same anomaly appeared in 4 other colonists with respiratory conditions, and that the air processor hypothesis was becoming difficult to sustain since 2 of the 4 cases involved conditions the air processors should have had no effect on. She filed both papers to the external networks Yara had established, the ones that connected to research bodies outside conclave jurisdiction. She did not know what Yara had built. She just knew that the network existed and that the paper needed to go somewhere it would be read. Lena, for her part, was not interested in her own medical file. She was interested in the megafauna. The megafauna research had started as a mapping project, Cassius's team logging the migration routes to help plan safe ground operations. In year 2, a young ecologist named Felix had taken the mapping data and started looking at it differently. Not as an obstacle to route around, but as a pattern to understand. What he found was structure. The creatures did not move randomly. They moved in routes that had not changed in 2 years of observation. In the parts that the conclave's earlier surveys had captured, they had not changed in the 40 years of survey data. The routes followed specific terrain features, specific vegetation zones, specific water sources. And within the routes, the creatures interacted with each other in ways that Felix kept describing in his notes as organized, and then crossing out and rewriting as structured, and then crossing out again because neither word felt precisely right. They were territorial. But territory, Felix kept arguing in his weekly research meetings, was not the same as simple aggression. Territory was resource management. It was an economy of space, and resource economies had rules. The colony had accidentally learned one of the rules in month 8. The deterrent field, when set at its lower frequency, did not drive the megafauna back. It stopped them. They would approach, feel the field, and wait. They were patient in the waiting. They could hold position for hours. An engineer named Sue had noticed this, and in the kind of moment that happened when very tired people stopped following protocols and started following instinct, had walked to the edge of the deterrent field and stood there. The creature on the other side was 9 meters, gray-brown, with a head the shape of a continent and eyes that reflected the colony lights like distant windows. It looked at her. She looked at it. She stepped back. The creature did not advance. She wrote it up in her incident report as, "No hostile action observed." Cassius had read it and circled that phrase and not said anything. In year 3, Lena was officially volunteering with Felix's research team. The school had approved a practical science program, and Felix had approved Lena because she asked the right questions and sat still for a long time without needing to fill the silence, in which was the most important quality for the kind of observation work they were doing. She sat at the deterrent field perimeter with Felix on a Tuesday afternoon and watched the migration come in from the east. The lead creature, the 14-meter one they had named Builder, for no reason Felix could remember now. Slowed at the field edge. It stopped. It looked at them with those window-reflective eyes. "It knows we're here," Lena said. "It's known we're here since month 1, Felix said. "No," Lena said. "I mean, it knows who we are. Specifically." Felix looked at her. She looked at Builder. Builder shifted its weight from one side to the other, which was what Builder did before it turned and led the migration along the established Western Detour route, the one it had been taking since month 4, the one that went around the colony instead of through it. "It chose the detour," Lena said. "On purpose." Felix wrote that down and stared at it for a long time. In the conclave's central chamber, Theron 4 faced an emergency session of the Governance Council. The chamber was not as dramatic as the Great Hall. Smaller, designed for work rather than ceremony, with screens covering 3 of the 4 walls and every delegate on site rather than projected. Theron 4 stood at the center table and looked at the data his team had compiled and felt, for the first time in this whole affair, something that was not quite certainty. "The agricultural output graph," said Delegate Air Nose from across the table. "Walk me through the agricultural output graph." "The colony is approaching 50% nutritional self-sufficiency," Theron 4 said. "We're ahead of any schedule we modeled." "Yes. The construction output, also ahead. The infant survival rate. The infant survival rate is comparable to mid-tier colony worlds operating under Class 6 conditions," Theron 4 said. And that silence that fell then was the kind that had a specific texture to it, a specific temperature. "This is a Class 15 world," Ernos said. "Yes. And the meta-infant?" "The Xenobiology Division's findings are in the supplementary materials. I recommend treating them as an isolated anomaly pending further study." The room was not convinced by this. The room contained 12 of the most experienced political minds in the conclave, and all 12 of them had read the Xenobiology report, and all 12 of them had read the phrase, "this should not," and understood what it meant when a conclusion of that nature was reached by people who spent their lives being confident. "I want a geological survey," Theron 4 said. "Deep strata, the classified dataset." The room went very still. "The classified dataset," Ernos repeated. "I need to understand the timeline," Theron 4 said. "I need to know how long we have before their ground operations reach depth." Nobody asked what timeline. Nobody asked what depth. The classified dataset for Kareth 9 was 80 years old, and not all of the delegates in the room knew it existed, but enough of them did. And the ones who did looked at the table and did not look at each other. "Authorized," Ernos said finally. The survey was ordered. The survey drones went out from the colony in month 37 as part of a routine mineral prospecting operation. Cassius had been pushing for a deep strata survey since year 2 because the colony's power needs would eventually outgrow the surface solar and geothermal system, and deep mineral extraction was the next logical step. Nobody had specifically planned the survey for this date. It was just the date the equipment was finally ready, and the team had the margin to run it. 6 drones drilling to 12 kilometers in 6 sites spread across the landing zone and surrounding plains. The mineral data came back first. It was good, better than expected. There were ore deposits that would keep the colony's manufacturing capacity growing for decades. Cassius read the mineral report at 7 a.m. with his second cup of coffee and felt the specific satisfaction of a man who has correctly predicted where the useful things would be. Then the structural anomaly data came back. It was flagged automatically by the analysis system, which had been programmed to flag anything that did not match the expected geological profile. The expected profile was solid rock formation interrupted by natural cavities, mineral pockets, and tectonic stress patterns. What the analysis system flagged was not any of those things. At 11 kilometers below the surface, at 4 of the 6 drilling sites, the sensors had found chambers. Not natural ones. Right-angle walls, flat floors, structural material that had a different density signature than the surrounding rock, which meant it had been manufactured rather than formed. The chambers were large. The largest was 400 meters across, and they were full. Cassius sat with the data on his screen for a very long time. He pulled up the conclave's public geological record for Kareth 9 and compared it to what the drones had returned. The public record showed solid rock at 11 kilometers. Uniform, unremarkable. the same profile extending downward. It was not the same. It was not even close to the same. The conclave's public record and his drone's actual data were describing two completely different structures, not slightly different, architecturally different. The way a building and a field were different. The kind of difference that did not happen by accident. Now he sat very still. He did not reach for his coffee. He stared at the data. "We've worked with worse," he said, to the empty room, in a voice that had none of the steadiness the phrase was supposed to carry. He did not mean it this time. He was not even sure why he said it. He said it the way people said certain things in the dark. Not because they believed them, but because the alternative was sitting in the silence without any words at all. He looked at the right-angle walls at 11 kilometers below the surface of a world that was supposedly an uninhabited, natural, Class 15 Deathworld. He looked at the flat floors. He looked at the manufactured structural material, dense and deliberate, surrounded by 800 years of accumulated rock. Then he started copying files. Every data packet, every scan, every comparison between what his drones had found and what the conclave's public record claimed was there. He worked for 2 hours, quietly and methodically, with the particular focus of a man who had learned a long time ago that the work itself was the steadiest thing you could put your hands on when everything else had gone uncertain. When the copies were complete, he sent them to a secure channel, to Yara Osi. He had not spoken to the ambassador in 8 months. She had set up a communication network in the colony's first week, an independent channel that went through 3 relay points before it reached the conclave system, routed in a way that made it look like routine administrative traffic. She had told him to use it only if he found something that mattered. He had found something that mattered. He sent the files and sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling of the engineering bay. The real ceiling, bare metal and conduit, and the places where the dome support structure showed through, and waited for the day to continue around him. The colony went on outside his door. The market was probably running. The school was probably in session. The megafauna migration had probably come and gone along its established detour route. Imara Meta was 3 years old now, running on Kareth 9 air, like it was the most natural thing in any universe. Everything was continuing. He sat in his chair and waited, and did not let himself think too far ahead of the next thing he needed to do. Outside, the planet went on with its enormous, indifferent business. Storm systems churning in the upper atmosphere. Cinnamon-scented plant life covering the valley floors in its toxic mats. 12-meter creatures moving on their ancient routes, carrying in their bodies the memory of something they had no words for. Following paths that had been walked for long enough that the rock itself remembered the wait. Yara Osi received the files at 3:14 in the morning. She was awake. She had been sleeping badly for 2 weeks, which was a rhythm she recognized. Her body's way of telling her that something was building toward a point. She had learned to listen to it. She made coffee and opened the channel and looked at what Cassius had sent her, and then she made more coffee and looked at it again. She pulled up the conclave's classified geological record for Kareth 9 alongside the drone data. She had obtained the classified record through the same channel she had used for the atmospheric data 2 years ago. She had held it without using it, waiting for the piece she did not yet have. She looked at the side-by-side comparison for a long time. Then she pulled up the classified geological records for 6 other worlds. She had those too. Different contact, different price, different file format, but the same essential category, the data the conclave did not release. The data that described what was actually below the surface of places the conclave had classified in particular ways for particular reasons. She laid them out on her screen. 7 worlds total, including Kareth 9. She looked at the deep strata profiles of all 7. The underground structures were present in every one. Different shapes, different materials, with different depths. The geology varied, the age varied, but the essential signature was the same. Manufactured chambers at depth, surrounded by rock that had been accumulating on top of them for a very long time. Centuries. In 2 of the worlds, longer than that. She sat with this for a while. Then she began building a database. What had happened to Kareth 9 was a process, not an event. This was the thing that took her the longest to fully understand. Going through the records she had and the records she acquired over the following 2 weeks through every channel she had, and some she assembled specifically for this purpose. It was not a single moment. It was a systematic procedure, applied methodically over years, by a body that had the patience and the reach and the institutional stability to do something slowly and thoroughly and then close the file. 800 years ago, Careth 9 had been Class 3. She found this in the oldest survey data the conclave had on record. The kind of historical archive that existed in its systems as background documentation, not something anyone was expected to look at, not something that had been suppressed exactly, but had simply been filed in the layers beneath the layers where things went when the people who knew about them were no longer in any position to connect them to current events. Class 3, temperate, breathable atmosphere, water on the surface. A biosphere that the ancient survey described as varied and complex, which was the standard language for this planet, is full of living things. It had been inhabited, not by visitors or temporary settlements, by a civilization. The survey data was from before the conclave's predecessor body had made contact, which meant the record was honest in a way that later records were not, because later records knew what had happened and had been written to not quite say it. The civilization was called, in the ancient survey's translation of their own name for themselves, the Keth, from which the planet's current name derived, in the specific way that places were named after the people who had been erased from them so that the name could remain while the people could not. The Keth had been spacefaring. Not at the conclave's level. They were early. Their technology was what the ancient survey assessed as promising, which was the standard language for not yet powerful enough to resist us. They had 7 cities. They had agriculture, infrastructure, a communication network, art, music, political structures. They had the things that civilizations had. They had also been in the way. The resource corridor that ran through Careth 9's star system was one of the most significant in the region. The conclave's predecessor body had wanted it. The Keth had been using it. There had been a negotiation of some kind. The records were vague here, deliberately vague, the vagueness of documents written to describe a decision without quite saying what the decision was. The negotiation had concluded. What followed was not listed as a war. It was listed as an ecological intervention. The conclave's predecessor body had introduced a retroviral agent into Careth 9's biosphere. Over 40 years, the agent had worked its way through the planet's ecosystem. It had targeted the Keth's cognitive architecture specifically, the neural structures that supported language, abstract reasoning, technology use, social coordination at scale. The agent had not killed them. It was not designed to kill. It was designed to simplify. 40 years later, the Keth were no longer building cities. They were no longer communicating in language. They were not dead. They were in the planet's valleys, moving in groups, following routes their muscles remembered from a life they no longer had the cognitive capacity to understand they had lost. The underground chambers were not ruins, and they were not archaeological remains. They were where the Keth had lived when they still knew what living meant. Sealed by rock-forming agents introduced in the final stages of the ecological intervention, buried under the slow accumulation of geological time. The conclave's predecessor body had reclassified Careth 9 as Class 15 200 years after the intervention was complete, by which point the planet's ecosystem had been sufficiently destabilized by the loss of its primary intelligent species that Class 15 was accurate. They had sealed the data. They had moved on. The resource corridor had been in conclave use for 600 years. Yara sat with all of this for a long time, not because she was surprised. She was not. She had suspected something in this neighborhood from the day she read the first atmospheric data, or from the day she understood that a Class 15 world was being offered as a gift. You did not gift a Deathworld to a species you wanted to thrive. You gifted it to a species you wanted to stop thinking about. What she was doing in those quiet hours was not arriving at understanding. She was completing it, filling the shape she had already suspected with a specific, exact, documented weight of what had actually happened. There was a difference between suspecting that a thing was monstrous and holding the full measure of its monstrousness in your hands. She held it. Then she started working. 17 worlds. She found 17. Not all of them were as complete as Careth 9. Some of the underground evidence was partial. Some of the historical survey data was too degraded to reconstruct fully. Sure, some of the classification changes were harder to date precisely, but 17 worlds carried the same signature in their deep strata. 17 worlds appeared in the historical record as inhabited and appeared in the current record as classified in the higher reaches of the scale, where no species went, with nothing in between to explain how they had gotten there. 17 civilizations, different sizes, different stages of development, different technologies, different everything, except the corridor or the resource or the territory they occupied that the conclave's predecessor or the conclave itself had wanted. She made a document. She was very careful with it. She did not editorialize. She did not use charged language. She simply put the data in order, the historical record next to the current classification, so the underground structure signatures next to the ecological record, the timing of each reclassification next to the timing of each resource corridor's integration into conclave-controlled systems. She let the sequence speak. The document was 63 pages when she was done. She had it verified by two contacts she trusted completely in different research networks, both outside conclave jurisdiction. Both of them came back within 48 hours with the same response, in different words, which amounted to, "This is accurate, and what do you need from us?" She told them what she needed. The conclave's vote took 4 days. The motion had been proposed by Theron 4's coalition under an emergency security classification, which meant the deliberations were sealed and the vote was held without public record of the debate. The motion was straightforward. Karath 9, under the provisions of Article 19 of the Colonial Governance Framework, to be placed under medical quarantine, pending investigation of anomalous biological developments. Medical quarantine. That was the language they used. Under Article 19, a quarantine world's communications could be restricted. Under Article 19, external vessels could be prohibited from making contact. Under Article 19, an intervention force could be deployed to enforce quarantine conditions. With the colonists' consent not legally required because the accord had a clause, and the clause covered this, and the clause was the whole point of why the accord had been written the way it had been written. The vote was 9-4. The 4 who voted against recorded their objections, and they were moved to review committees within the hour. Theron 4 authorized the deployment of a quarantine enforcement fleet. 14 vessels, 3 weeks to reach Karath 9 at standard transit speed. He sent no message to the colony. There was no legal requirement to do so. The accord was clear. Yara received notification of the vote through a conclave staff contact who did not record the notification and who had, over a distinguished 40-year career in conclave administration, developed a very finely calibrated understanding of which rules were structural and which ones were the kind that decent people worked around. She had 11 days before the fleet launched. She spent them working. The transmission system she used was not the one from the original departure. That had been a one-shot construction designed for the moment. This was something she had been building for 3 years through the independent network the original transmission had established, a system made of agreements rather than hardware, of relationships rather than infrastructure. A message she sent would travel from relay to relay, each one a contact who had read what she sent 3 years ago and had been waiting, in the way that people waited when they had been given information they did not know what to do with yet, but understood they might someday need to. The full document went to every independent species network outside conclave jurisdiction. 17 planets, the historical record for each one, the geological signatures, the ecological intervention timeline, the reclassification dates, the resource corridor acquisition dates, the current classification status of each world and the status of the beings who had once lived on them. And Karath 9, the gift, the accord in its Article 7, subsection C, the vote with its 9-4 margin, and the 4 objectors moved to committees within the hour. The quarantine fleet launched and en route. She sent it in 12 formats in 11 languages and with translation keys for 47 more. She included coordinates for each of the 17 worlds so that anyone who wanted to go and look could go and look. She sent one additional file separately to a smaller list, to the species whose deep history records she had cross-referenced, the ones whose own archives contained references to civilizations that had simply stopped existing at convenient times. She sent them the names of the dead civilizations, the ones she had been able to reconstruct from the ancient surveys. the ones the conclave's records listed as pre-contact extinctions. She sent the Keth's name to the beings whose ancestors the conclave had told were extinct. Then she sat in her quarters in the conclave embassy district, in the city that the conclave had built to show the galaxy what 400 years of stable governance looked like, with the engineered fountains running outside in the plaza and the artificial clouds drifting near the ceiling of the Great Hall 2 streets away. She made coffee. She did not wait to see what happened. She knew what she had built. She had been building it for 3 years, and it was sound. The fleet launched on schedule. 14 vessels, quarantine class, with the capacity to restrict communications, maintain orbital exclusion, and if necessary, deploy surface enforcement teams. The fleet commander was an experienced officer named Drev On, who had run 3 quarantine operations in his career and who approached the Karath 9 assignment with professional detachment. It was a standard operation, anomalous colony situation, medical concerns. He had his orders and his legal framework and the full weight of the conclave's authority behind him. He was 2 weeks out when his private communications terminal began receiving messages. The first was from his sister, who was a biologist working in an independent research network outside conclave jurisdiction, and who had forwarded him a document with a message attached that said only, "Read this and then think about what you're doing." He read the document. He put it down. He picked it up and read it again. He sat in his command cabin for 4 hours before he came back to the bridge. In the relay stations between the conclave's core systems and the outer networks, the document was traveling at the speed of light in every direction. It was being read on research stations and in government chambers, and in the private quarters of species the conclave had spent decades describing as too primitive to merit full diplomatic status. It was being read by historians and scientists, and politicians and ordinary people who read the 63 pages and sat with it the way people sat with things that changed the shape of everything they thought they knew about the world they lived in. It was being read by 3 of the 4 conclave delegates who had voted against the quarantine motion, who were currently sitting in review committees, and who forwarded the document to every contact they had outside the conclave's internal communication system. The 4th dissenting delegate did not forward it. He walked directly into the conclave's public media office and released it himself, under his own name, with a statement attached that was the first thing he had done in his career that he was completely certain was right. On Karath 9, Cassius Veld received a message from Yara in the early morning of day 1089. The message was short: "Fleet incoming. 14 vessels, 3 weeks. I have done what I can from here. The rest is yours. They will arrive expecting a colony on its knees. Show them what you've built." Cassius read the message twice. He made coffee. He sat with it. Then he called a colony-wide meeting. 49,107 people gathered in every dome simultaneously, connected by the internal broadcast system. Cassius stood in the center of Dome 1 and talked in the same voice he used for everything. Steady, clear, not theatrical, not loud. He told them about the fleet. He told them why it was coming. He told them what the document Yara had sent said, and he showed them the key sections on the main screens. He told them about the Keth. He told them about the 17 worlds. He told them about what was underneath their feet at 11 kilometers. He did not tell them what to do. He was not built for that kind of telling. He just told them what was true, in the way he always tried to tell people what was true. All of it, the hard parts included. Because people who had been living on a Class 15 Deathworld for 3 years had demonstrated fairly conclusively that they could handle the hard parts. The silence when he stopped talking was enormous. It lasted about 30 seconds. Then a structural engineer in Dome 4 raised her hand and asked whether the deterrent field perimeter could be extended to cover a wider defense radius by the time the fleet arrived. And someone in Dome 2 started running those calculations live on a shared screen, and the silence broke into the familiar sound of 50,000 people who had been working through impossible problems for 3 years, deciding without ceremony to work through the next one. Marcus Webb did not raise his hand. He did not make calculations. He went back to his quarters and picked up his saxophone and sat with it in his lap for a long time. Then he started playing. The sound went through the dome walls and bounced off metal and recycled air, and the particular silence that came after very large things had been said, and it was not great acoustically, and it did not matter. Nobody asked him to stop. The fleet dropped out of FTL at 0600 hours local Karath 9 time, which meant nothing to anyone on the planet because they had stopped using standard conclave time designations 8 months ago and were operating on a local cycle that suited the 18-hour day. They had a word for dawn on Karath 9 now, a word that one of the teachers had invented and the children had adopted and the adults had followed, because that was usually how language worked in the colony. One, the word was Kethrise, and it had nothing to do with the conclave's timekeeping. And this small fact was one of the many things the fleet commander had not been told to expect. Drevan stood at the observation window of his command ship and looked down at Karath 9 from orbit. He had reviewed the conclave's briefing materials extensively. Standard preparation. He knew the atmospheric profile, the terrain maps, the colony coordinates, the dome layout, the population count. He had a clear picture in his mind of what a 3-year-old colony on a Class 15 Deathworld would look like from orbit. What he was looking at was not that picture. The thermal signature of the colony was 3 times the footprint the briefing had shown. Not the footprint from last month's observation satellite report. Not the footprint from 6 months ago. Not the footprint from the original landing. The dome complex had expanded from 6 domes to 19, connected by a network of enclosed corridors that covered an area that his sensor team estimated at 11 square kilometers. The power output signature suggested an energy generation capacity well above what 6 domes of original spec could have produced, which meant they had built new generation infrastructure, which meant they had either found local materials to build it with, or they had been considerably more resourceful with their cargo inventory than the manifest had suggested. He asked for a comparison with the last observation satellite report. The report was 6 weeks old. In 6 weeks, the colony had added 2 more domes. He stood at the window for a while. "Get me a ground-level optical feed," he said. The cameras on the observation satellite reoriented. The feed came up on his main screen. He looked at it. At the edge of the colony's perimeter, the extended perimeter, the one that covered 11 square kilometers, the deterrent field markers stood in a line. And at the edge of the deterrent field on the outside, a migration group of megafauna had come to a stop. Not because the field was pushing them back. The field was off. They were stopped because a group of 5 humans in full environment suits were standing at the perimeter edge, and the creatures were watching them, and the humans were watching the creatures, and nothing was happening. Nothing was happening in a very specific way, the way that nothing happened when something had been negotiated. "Sir," said his tactical officer, "the colony is not responding to hail." "They've heard it," Drevan said. "Try again." Cassius Veld took the hail on the second attempt, because the first attempt had come during the morning engineering briefing, and he had been in the middle of a structural calculation that needed finishing. He answered when he was done with the calculation. He appeared on Drevan's screen in work clothes, with dust from Karath 9's surface on his jacket, holding a coffee. "Commander," he said. "Colony Administrator Veld," Drevan said. "This is Fleet Commander Drevan. I am here under the authority of the Galactic Conclave's Article 19 quarantine provision. I am required to inform you." "I know why you're here," Cassius said. The statement landed in the transmission with the particular weight of words from someone who had known for a while. "You should know," Cassius added, "that Ambassador Osei has transmitted the full evidentiary record regarding Karath 9 and 16 other worlds to every independent network outside Conclave jurisdiction. That happened 14 days ago. I am going to assume you've received some version of it." Drevan said nothing. "I'm also going to assume," Cassius said, "that you've been reading your private messages, and that some of them have been from people who know you well enough to say difficult things to you." This was accurate. "I'm not going to make any threats," Cassius said. "I don't have a military. I have engineers and farmers, and 3 theoretical physicists and a jazz musician. What I have is this planet, which is ours, and the truth about what this planet is and what was done to it, and the fact that 50,000 people are currently alive on it who were sent here to not be. Commander, I don't know you, but I think you should talk to your captains before you decide anything." Cassius finished his coffee. "Take your time," he said. "We're not going anywhere." The channel closed. Drevan talked to his captains. It was not a comfortable set of conversations. He had 12 captains under his command. 3 of them had received Yara's document through their private channels and had been carrying the weight of it for 2 weeks without an obvious place to put it down. 4 more had received it in the last 48 hours, forwarded by family members and colleagues, and in one case by a species government official who had attached a formal diplomatic note that conclave legal precedent had never been designed to handle. 2 of the 12 captains were from species whose own archives, historical records the conclave had consistently described as mythologically unreliable, contained references to civilizations that had simply ceased to exist at times that now, mapped against the data Yara had assembled, had a different explanation. One of those 2 captains, a woman named Commander Velos, had an ancestor recorded in her species' oldest oral tradition as one of the last engineers of a city that had been named in her ancestral language, something that translated approximately as the place the ground remembers. She had learned this in childhood. She had thought of it as a story. She sat in her command cabin for 2 hours after the captain's call with Cassius, and then she requested a channel to Drevon directly. "And I won't enforce the quarantine," she said. It was simple. No elaboration, no argument, just the statement sitting there in the channel between them. Drevon said nothing for a moment. "Velos, I won't," she said, "not because of my personal situation, though I acknowledge that is part of it. Because the legal framework being invoked to justify this action is itself built on the foundation of what that document describes. I am not going to be the tool of a structure that has spent 400 years building its authority on the destruction of what my ancestors built." She paused. "Sir." He let that sit. He asked for a poll of the captains. He did not make it an order. He asked, which was not standard procedure, but the situation had left standard procedure somewhere behind them. 7 of 12 would not enforce the quarantine. The other 5 said nothing, which in Drevon's experience was the way that people said things they would not say out loud. Theron IV's firing order came through the command channel at 1400 hours. Drevon received it. He read it. He put it down. He thought about 40 years of his career. He thought about the conclave's emblem that was on everything in his command ship. On the walls, on the uniforms, on the seal of every document he had ever signed. He thought about what he had believed the emblem meant, and what the evidence suggested it meant, and the distance between those 2 things. He picked up the order and read it a second time. Then he walked to the bridge. The bridge crew looked at him. "The firing order has been received," he said. "I am not going to execute it." Silence. "And anyone who wishes to challenge this decision may file a formal objection through the command record. I will note each objection personally and make sure it is preserved in full." He looked at each of them in turn. "Does anyone wish to do that?" Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The order sat in the command system, unexecuted, the cursor blinking next to it with the patience of a machine that had no opinion about what happened next. Drevon opened a channel to the colony. "Colony Administrator Veld," he said, "this is Drevon. The quarantine order will not be enforced. I am requesting a formal communication channel between my fleet and your colony administration, outside conclave authority, for the purpose of coordinating what happens next." He paused. "No, I apologize for the circumstances that brought us here." There was a short silence on the other end. "Noted," said Cassius Veld, in a tone that carried something different than those words usually carried. Something warmer, something that almost had a different name. What happened next took 11 years. Not a war. There was no war. The conclave did not fall to military force. It fell to the specific and unglamorous process of being held accountable by the beings it had managed for 4 centuries. And accountability moves slowly because everything large moves slowly, and because the conclave's legal and political structures were very complicated and had been built by very careful people who understood that complicated structures were harder to dismantle than simple ones. There were hearings. There were tribunals. And there were sessions in the Great Hall with its engineered clouds where species that the conclave had told other species were extinct sent delegations and sat in chairs and presented evidence in front of audiences who had needed the conclave to be something other than what it was, and who were now in the slow process of adjusting. The 4 delegates who had voted against the quarantine were reinstated. Their formal objections, already in the record, became the foundation of the first independent inquiry. Theron IV was removed from his position in year 2 of the process. He did not resist this. He had been in conclave governance for 40 years, and he understood what legitimate process looked like and he understood that the process now running was legitimate, which was perhaps the most clarifying fact of his career. He gave testimony for 6 sessions. He answered every question accurately. He had always believed, and continued to believe, that the decisions he had made had been correct in the frame he had been operating in. And he said this clearly, and the tribunal recorded it clearly. And the tribunal found that the frame itself had been the problem, which was perhaps the most accurate verdict that could be delivered. It was not a clean process. It was not triumphant. Nobody made speeches about justice because the people inside it were too tired for speeches and too clear-eyed about what 11 years of legal and political restructuring actually looked like from the inside, which was mostly reports, mostly meetings, mostly the slow work of rewriting structures that had been standing for 400 years and that a great many species depended on for stability even now, even knowing what they knew. Yara Osei did not return to the Conclave Embassy District. She went to Karath 9 in year 2 on the first independent transport that made the journey under the new provisional status the colony had been granted, while the legal proceedings established its permanent classification. She came through the dome entry corridor in a standard environment suit, and Cassius met her at the airlock with a coffee that was, by any objective measure, not good. She drank it. "We've worked with worse," he said. "Yes," she said, "we have." Karath 9's reclassification took 6 months of committee work and 2 full committee collapses before anyone agreed on language. The problem was not the classification level. That was straightforward. The problem was the sovereignty designation, which was new enough in the framework that 3 different legal traditions had 3 different opinions about how it should be written, and all 3 traditions were currently relevant, and nobody wanted to get it wrong. A conclave bureaucrat whose job it was to finalize the language submitted a draft that used a formulation Yara's legal team found inadequate. She read the draft. She put it down. "Noted," she said. The room understood, fully and finally, what that word meant in her mouth, and the draft was revised. The final classification was entered in the official conclave record, which was in the process of being made a public document rather than a controlled one. On the morning of Karath 9's local Keth Rise on year 11, day 4 of the restructured conclave's first open session. Class 1, sovereign, independent, the first planet humanity had not inherited, not borrowed, not been assigned and supervised and monitored. The first one that was simply, completely, by the weight of 3 years of survival and 8 years of legal record and 63 pages of evidence assembled by a woman who had signed a death sentence with a steady hand because she had a plan. Theirs. Amara Mehta was 11 years old. She was outside when the announcement came through the colony broadcast system. She was at the far edge of the perimeter, which was technically against protocol for children under 14. But she went there often because the megafauna came close to this edge in the early morning, and she liked to be near them when they did. She had been doing this for 3 years, and nobody had been able to make a compelling argument against it, because the creatures did not behave toward her the way the deterrence protocol assumed they would. They did not behave toward her like something to be deterred. The broadcast came through the comm unit, clipped to her suit. She listened to it. She looked at Builder, who was standing 8 meters away, watching her with those window-light eyes. Builder shifted his weight. The broadcast ended. Amara reached up and disconnected the seals on her helmet with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing manual work since she was 6. She lifted the helmet off. The morning air of Karath 9 hit her face, full, unfiltered, the 3 hostile layers and all. And she breathed it in with the easy, unthinking confidence of lungs that had never needed a filter for this air, and never would. She breathed. Builder watched her breathe. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and between them was the particular quality of silence that existed when something had been waiting to be acknowledged for a very long time, and was finally, in this small, quiet moment, acknowledged. She did not know the full history of what he carried. She was 11. She knew what her teachers had told her, what the colony record said, what her mother had explained when she was old enough to understand it. The shape of what Karath 9 had been, the shape of what had been done to it, on the shape of the things that moved across it now carrying in their bodies the ghost memory of a civilization they could no longer comprehend. She could not give that back. Nobody could. The process running in the conclave's reform chambers could do many things and could not do that one. And everyone who looked at it honestly knew it and carried it, because it needed to be carried by someone. But she breathed Karath Nine's air, and Builder watched her breathe it, and maybe that was something. Maybe that was a small piece of something that did not have a name yet but would, because humans named everything eventually, and because the children growing up on this planet would have more time than she did to find the right words. Behind her, from the direction of the main dome complex, she could hear the colony. She had grown up inside that sound. The market on Tuesdays, the school in session, the engineering teams running their equipment in the fabrication bay, the three theoretical physicists arguing in the research corridor. Marcus Webb somewhere, playing saxophone badly in a space with difficult acoustics. The colony, which was a word that meant something different now. Not a settlement on someone else's terms. Not a population placed somewhere to resolve a problem. Just people, on their planet, doing what people did when they had enough room and enough time and enough reason to keep going. She put her helmet back on. She looked at Builder one more time. Builder turned, unhurried, and led his group along the morning route, or the route his kind had walked since before the colony existed, and before the rock above the buried chambers had accumulated, and before everything that had been done had been done. The route that the ground remembered, and that he remembered with his whole ancient body. Amara watched him go. Then she turned and walked back toward the domes, toward the sound of 50,000 people living their ordinary, improbable, hard-won lives on a world that had been designed to be their end and had instead become their beginning. The Karath 9 sky above her was brown and purple at the edges, where the atmosphere layers caught the light. The cinnamon smell of the sweet grass was faint on the morning wind. She breathed it in. She kept walking.